In this video, we're going to be tackling the second little part of Beethoven's Für Elise, as I've broken it up, and that's this part. And then we're back to where we were in the last video. So like I did before, I'm going to tell you fingerings, first for the right hand, then for the left hand, and then we'll put them together. Now this part's a little bit more complicated than the last part, and that means that there are choices. There's more than one possible way to do the fingerings. So I will show you one way that will work, and then I'll also show you one common alternative. So here's one way that will work, starting with the right hand. 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 5, 4, 3, 1, 5, 4, 3, 1, 5, 4, 3, 1, 1, 5, 1, 5, 2, 3, 3, 5, 4, 5, 4, 5, 2, 4, 3, 1. And then we're back to the first part. And then the corresponding left hand would go like this. 5, 2, 1, 5, 1, 2, 5, 2, 1, 5, 1, 5, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. And then back to 5, 2, 1, 5, 1, 2, where we were before. And when you put them together, of course, it looks like this. And then back to the first part. Now, the first little bit of what I showed you, there's really only one reasonable way to do it, and that's this part here. Up to that note, that's really the only reasonable way to do it. But when you get here, then there's choices in terms of how to do these octaves. And in particular, you'll see in the music, at least some copies of the music, a different way suggested. And I'll show you that. See, the way I showed you to do this is the left hand will play with 5 and then 1, this first octave, and then the right hand will play this note twice with the thumb. And then the left hand comes up, and then the right hand, and then we're into this little pattern. And so coming from the last measure, that looks like this. And so on. Now another way that you'll see this played is instead of playing this octave here and then having the right hand play this note here twice, what you'll see is the little finger 5, the little finger of the left hand will jump. It'll catch this bottom note and then it will jump up here and the left hand will play this octave and you'll be into this sort of walking pattern. See, it jumps and then... So coming from the previous measure, this is how that would look. And maybe the advantage of doing it that way is that you do get into this nice little pattern. But the disadvantage is that you have to do this jump and it's easy to miss. It's a place where you can easily make a mistake. I mean, it's easy to hit that note by accident or to hit that note by accident. You could even try jumping back and forth here and see if you can do it that fast, you know, with just the little finger. And you'll see it creates an opportunity to make a mistake. And that's why I didn't show you to do it that way. The way I showed you to do it, all your fingers are already in place to do it, coming from the previous measure. See, everything's in place there. Now, the drawback of my way is that you don't get into that neat little pattern. Instead, you're playing this note in the middle twice with your thumb. And that's maybe a little bit ugly from a visual perspective, at least. But I'm really splitting hairs here. I mean, you could do it either way perfectly well. So the way I showed you, I think, is easier and it has less opportunity for mistake. Now, while I'm on the subject, I may as well tell you that this little pattern that I showed you is useful for a lot of things. I mean, you could walk all the way up the keyboard that way. Or you could do a glorified scale, for instance. And it's also a good way to add notes to something to make it more impressive or more complicated or whatever. You know, for instance, say I have a melody like... I'll show you here one way to make it bigger or more impressive. I'm going to move it to the left hand. And then I'm going to add a bunch of notes around it using this kind of, you know, walking sort of pattern. So that's just one illustration of how you can use that sort of thing to, well, make things bigger, I guess. All right, so back to Für Elise. I'm going to play this little section with 3 tempos, first very slow, and then medium, and then fast. Now, in terms of the counting, these first 3 notes, those 3, before you get to this one, those come on the last 3 notes of the previous measure. So you would be counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And so that's how we're going to come in. Now, I'm not going to count all the way through. I'm just going to count at the beginning so you can know what the tempo is if you're trying to follow along yourself. So here's the slow tempo. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And I played all the way through to the end of that section so you could put it together with what you did in the last video. Okay, here's the medium tempo. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And here's the fast tempo, up to speed. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We've got the notes now, so let's talk a little bit about interpretation. Now, the first thing to talk about is how this part comes after the last part that we did in the previous video, what the transition between the two is, and that is that it is building up coming into this part here. So I'm going to play from the beginning of the piece, and you'll see that when we get to this part how it builds up. And so on. So when we got right to this part, you see it built up. And the music, at least the copies I've looked at, will indicate that. It actually shows a louder dynamics marking here. Now, in the right hand here, you have 4-note phrases. See, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm counting numbers of notes here, not fingers, of course. But those are 4-note phrases. And so this first one will build up. And then the next one will be big. And then the next one will be a little smaller. And then the next one will be much smaller. Because these last three, they're shaped the same way, right? They're just different sizes in terms of how loud they are. They're getting softer because they're coming down and they're getting softer. So then when you get to this part, right before the octaves, there it's very quiet. When you hit this note here, it's very quiet. Now, when you're going up with those octaves, it's building up somewhat. It doesn't get really loud, but it builds up somewhat. And in particular, you ought to hear this top note. It should ring out like a bell, maybe, a bell-like sort of sound. So maybe something like this coming from the previous measure. See, you want to hear that come out. This does build up. It's just, it's not like... You're not pounding them out, but you're getting a little bit bigger, and this one at the top comes out. Now, another thing to notice is that in a lot of the copies of the music, there is a tempo marking that says retardando, slow down, when you get to this part where the hands are switching. And some people exaggerate that a lot. I would prefer to think of it as sort of a hesitation. I mean, you're not really lingering there, you're just hesitating. And the idea behind it is that what you're aiming toward, of course, is getting back to this familiar part. And so it's like the piece is hesitating a little bit and sorting itself out with this. But it's not really stopping or lingering or whatever. You could, of course, add more change in tempo than what I've been doing. And here, for instance, would be maybe an exaggerated version of what you could do with the expression. And some people might like that. I don't like to stretch it out that much because I don't like to break up the rhythm of the piece that much. But there should be some change there. It should be, what it's like is it's narrowing down, it's focusing on these particular notes. And you also do not want pedal there. You certainly do not want, you don't want that blurring. You want everything focusing, narrowing down on those specific notes. And then it will spread out again once it gets back to the familiar part. So let's play it one more time and put it all together. And in the next video, we will tackle the most technically difficult part of the piece.